Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. You don't notice it at first, not really. It's just another pair of headlights in the distance, another hum in the rhythm of a long, desolate drive. But when you glance at the rearview mirror for the third time in 20 minutes, it starts to gnaw at the edges of your thoughts. That car, sleek, black, its headlights cold and unwavering, has been there too long, too steady. I was on my way back from visiting my parents in the mountains, taking the back roads because they promised peace, quiet, and a faster trip home. I had work in the morning and no time for city traffic. It was just me, my old sedan, and the empty highway cutting through the forest, with no other car in sight, except for the one behind me. I slowed down slightly, letting the other car pass, but it didn't. The headlights stayed fixed in my mirror, like twin eyes glaring back at me. It's probably just a coincidence, I muttered to myself, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. They're taking the same route, that's all. But that didn't explain the feeling crawling up my spine. The car never got closer, never drifted farther away. Just followed, silent and steady, as if tethered to me. An hour later, the road grew darker. The moon had retreated behind a blanket of clouds, and the trees on either side of the highway loomed like shadowy sentinels. I fiddled with the radio, trying to drown out the silence, but all I got was static. The headlights in my mirror hadn't wavered once. Not a turn, not a signal, not a flicker. I tested my theory again, slowing to a crawl. The black car slowed too, matching my speed perfectly. My heart began to pound in my chest. Okay, this is ridiculous. I pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath my tires. The other car didn't pass me. Instead, it stopped about 50 feet behind, its headlights still burning into my rearview mirror. For a moment, I sat frozen, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Should I get out? Confront them? Call someone? But who would I call? And what would I say? A car is following me? It sounded paranoid. Crazy, even. I glanced back. The black car was still there, engine idling, the faint outline of its sleek frame visible under the weak glow of my taillights. I couldn't see the driver. That's when I made my mistake. I rolled down the window. "Hey!" My voice trembled despite my attempt to sound firm. "Do you need something? Are you lost?" No response. Just the low, steady purr of its engine. I grabbed my phone, flicking on the flashlight, and leaned out the window, shining it toward the car. The beam of light hit its windshield, but revealed nothing. No driver, no movement. I shivered and pulled myself back inside. My nerves screamed at me to drive, to get out of there, but my curiosity kept me rooted in place. I stared at the black car, willing it to do something, anything, to make sense of this bizarre situation. And then, it turned off its headlights. The sudden darkness swallowed the road. I fumbled for my own switch, flipping my high beams on to illuminate the car behind me. But it was gone. I blinked, my pulse roaring in my ears. My heart raced as I craned my neck, scanning the road and the surrounding woods. No trace of it. It had disappeared as if it had never been there. Shaking, I forced myself back onto the road. My car felt too small, too exposed. Every shadow on the road seemed to ripple and move. I sped up, trying to put distance between me and whatever had just happened. The minutes dragged on, the darkness pressing closer. My eyes flicked constantly between the road and the mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. And then they reappeared. This time the black car was closer, too close. Its headlights bore into my rear window like knives. I slammed the gas, my old sedan groaning in protest as the speedometer climbed. The black car matched me, staying inches from my bumper. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, the engine roaring in my ears. "What do you want?" I screamed, though there was no one to hear me. The black car swerved suddenly, pulling alongside me. My peripheral vision caught a glimpse of its tinted windows, impossibly dark, revealing nothing inside, and then it swerved closer. I jerked the wheel, my tires screeching as I veered away. The car didn't let up, forcing me toward the edge of the road. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my pulse hammered in my throat. With one last desperate move, I yanked the wheel hard, sending my car careening into a narrow side road. Gravel sprayed as I sped into the trees, the path winding and unfamiliar. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breath, my headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven terrain. For a moment, there was silence. No headlights, no roaring engine. I allowed myself to breathe, glancing in the mirror. Nothing. Just the empty road behind me. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end before I even saw it. The black car appeared again, this time ahead of me, blocking the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding to a stop. My heart pounded as I stared at it, the silhouette of the car barely visible under the faint starlight. Its headlights were off, but I could feel its presence like a physical weight. And then the door opened. A figure stepped out, tall, impossibly still, its form cloaked in shadow. It stood there, watching, or at least I thought it was watching. I couldn't see its face, only the vague outline of a head, shoulders, and long limbs. I threw the car into reverse, the wheels spinning wildly as I tried to back away. But the figure moved. It didn't run. It didn't walk. It simply appeared closer. No. My voice cracked as I floored the accelerator, spinning the wheel hard to avoid the figure. My car jolted over the rough terrain, branches scraping against the sides like claws. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only focus was escape. Somehow I found my way back to the main road. It was empty again, as if the black car had never existed. My hands trembled on the wheel as I drove, too terrified to stop. I didn't see the black car again that night, but the feeling lingered. The oppressive weight of being watched. When I finally reached my apartment, I parked under the brightest street lamp I could find and bolted inside, locking every door and window. But the next morning, as I stepped outside to go to work, I froze. There, parked across the street, was the black car. Its headlights flicked on. I always loved libraries, but if I had known what lurked in the shadowed aisles of the old Braywood Library, I would have burned every book in my collection and never stepped foot in one again. The first time I heard it, I thought it was my imagination. A faint whisper, like the rustle of pages turning, but somehow layered with words I couldn't quite catch. I froze mid-step, the dim amber light from the old sconces barely illuminating the towering bookshelves around me. The sound came again, low, insistent, and undeniably real. I turned, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one else there. Just the books. Hundreds of them stacked in shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the gloom. I was new to Braywood, having just taken up a teaching position at the local high school. My colleagues spoke of the library as a hidden gem, a place rich with history and an invaluable resource for a history buff like me. But don't stay too late, one of them, Mr. Grayson, warned with a half-smile. When I asked why, he just shrugged and muttered something about stories before changing the subject. My first visit was uneventful. The librarian, Mrs. Halbridge, was a petite woman with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through you. She handed me a visitor's card and warned me not to go into the restricted section without permission. "It's for your own safety," she said cryptically. I laughed it off. What danger could books possibly pose? It was a week later when I decided to explore the deeper aisles. The library had an almost hypnotic quality. The scent of aged paper and leather bindings hung in the air like incense. and the silence was absolute, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my steps. I was engrossed in a volume on local folklore when I heard it. The faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through a cracked window, but there were no windows in this part of the library. The sound seemed to come from the books themselves. I leaned closer to the shelves, my breath fogging up the glass doors, and that's when I realized the whispers weren't random. They were words. Faint, fragmented, and unintelligible, but definitely words. I told myself I was imagining it. Too many late nights grading papers, maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the books were watching me. I laughed at the absurdity of the thought, but the hairs on the back of my neck refused to settle. The whispers grew louder over my next few visits. They seemed to follow me, starting in one aisle and fading into another, always just out of reach. Mrs. Hulbridge noticed my distracted state one evening and gave me a knowing look. "You've been hearing them, haven't you?" she asked. "Hearing what?" I replied, though my voice betrayed me. She sighed and placed a bony hand on my arm. "This library is different. The books here hold more than just stories. Some of them remember, some of them want to be read, and some don't." I laughed nervously, but her words unsettled me. That night, I stayed late, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. The whispers led me to the restricted section. The door was locked, but the key hung on a nail just beside it, a temptation too great to resist. The second I turned the key in the lock, the whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices tumbling over each other in an incomprehensible frenzy. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was colder, the light dimmer. The shelves here were lined with ancient tomes, their spines cracked and titles faded. A large desk stood in the center of the room, and on it lay a single book, bound in black leather. It was open to a blank page, but the whispers seemed to pour from it like an unseen fog. I don't know what possessed me to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the cover, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and absolute that it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, the writing appeared. Black ink bled across the blank page, forming words that chilled me to my core. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, heart racing, but the book wasn't done. The words shifted, rearranging themselves into a new sentence. "Now you belong to us." The door behind me slammed shut, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They weren't incomprehensible anymore. They were chanting my name. I yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered, and shadows began to move between the shelves, taking shapes that shouldn't exist. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the library itself was closing in on me. Desperation fueled my strength, and with one final tug, the door flew open. I ran, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and more insistent with every step. By the time I burst out into the main library, Mrs. Hulbridge was waiting for me. Her expression was grim. "I warned you," she said, shaking her head. "Once they mark you, they don't let go." I demanded answers, but she refused to say more. She only urged me to leave and never return. "You're lucky you got out," she whispered. "Most don't." I tried to put the incident behind me, but the books wouldn't let me. Every book I opened at home seemed to carry a faint echo of those whispers. The words on the pages shifted when I wasn't looking, forming messages that made my blood run cold. I started seeing shadows in my apartment, tall, humanoid figures that vanished when I turned to face them. My dreams were worse, filled with visions of the library's aisles stretching endlessly, trapping me in their maze while the whispers mocked me. One night, unable to take it anymore, I returned to the library. It was the only way to stop the madness. The building was dark and silent, the front door unlocked as if it had been expecting me. The whispers welcomed me as soon as I stepped inside, soft and almost soothing this time. They led me back to the restricted section, where the black book still sat on the desk, waiting. The writing on the page was different now. Finish the story. I don't know why I obeyed. Maybe it was the promise of release, or maybe I had simply lost the will to fight. I picked up the pen that lay beside the book and began to write. The words flowed from me as if they had been waiting all along, spilling secrets I didn't know I possessed. When I finished, the whispers stopped. The air grew still. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of peace. And then, the book slammed shut. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The lights flickered out, leaving me in total darkness. And now, as I write this, the whispers have returned, louder and angrier than ever. I think they want you to come next. I always considered myself a skeptic until the night I faced death, and something unexplainable pulled me back. It started innocently enough. My name is Jason Adler. I'm 32, a freelance photographer from Seattle. I was on an assignment photographing abandoned places for a coffee table book. That weekend, I had my sights set on Ridgeway Asylum, an infamous and long-abandoned mental hospital deep in the woods of Montana. The asylum had a sordid history, unsanctioned experiments, rumors of torture, and mysterious disappearances of both patients and staff. Locals whispered of screams echoing in the woods at night, and the restless souls of those who never left. I dismissed it all as folklore designed to keep kids from sneaking onto the property. I was there to capture atmospheric shots, not hunt ghosts. But as I parked my SUV at the end of the overgrown gravel road, I felt a chill run down my spine. The asylum loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the pale moonlight. Broken windows, peeling paint, and an eerie stillness gave the building an unsettling presence. As I approached, camera slung around my neck, the air grew unnaturally cold. My breath fogged in front of me despite the mild weather forecast. I told myself it was just the elevation, or maybe my nerves. Inside, the asylum was worse than I expected. Rusted gurneys, shattered glass, and graffiti-covered walls screamed of neglect. The smell of mildew and decay was almost overpowering. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first hour passed uneventfully. I snapped photos of decrepit hallways, crumbling walls, and graffiti scrawled with phrases like, "They're still here," and "Don't listen to them." As I ventured deeper, the oppressive silence became unbearable. Then, I heard it, a whisper. At first it was faint, indistinct, like the wind carrying a hushed conversation. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew clearer. "Jason." The whisper carried my name. A shiver raced down my spine as I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hallway behind me was empty. My heart pounded as I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I pressed on, determined to finish my shoot. But the further I explored, the heavier the air became. Every step felt labored, like wading through an invisible swamp. Then, I found the room. The door was partially ajar, its number barely visible under a layer of grime. Something about it felt wrong. My gut told me to turn back, but my curiosity overruled my instincts. I nudged the door open, and my flashlight illuminated a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls were covered in symbols, hundreds of them, scratched into the paint. Some resembled runes, others were shapes I couldn't recognize. A rusted bed frame sat in the center, its mattress blackened and torn. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. And then I saw the writing. Scrawled across the far wall in what looked like dried blood were the words, "Do not stay after midnight." A sudden bang echoed from somewhere down the hall. My flashlight flickered, my instincts screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to move. Then the temperature plummeted. My breath became visible, hanging in the air like smoke. And that's when I felt it, cold, clammy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. No one was there. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices all speaking over one another. My head throbbed as the noise grew deafening, incomprehensible, yet maddeningly clear. "Get out." The words boomed, not from the whispers, but from deep within my own mind. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. In the darkness, I felt the chains above the bed suddenly tighten, as though an invisible force had gripped them. Then I saw it. A shadow, tall, distorted, with impossibly long limbs, emerged from the corner of the room. Its face was a void, darker than the shadows that surrounded it. 2 pinpricks of crimson light burned where eyes should have been. It didn't move, but I could feel its intent. It wanted me gone. Or worse. Gathering what little courage I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and bolted. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop until I reached the main entrance. The doors slammed shut in front of me. I pounded on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The whispers were back, louder and angrier, as if I'd violated some unspoken rule. Then the shadow appeared again, this time at the end of the hallway. It didn't walk, it glided, closing the distance between us unnaturally fast. Panicked, I turned and ran, ducking into another corridor. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness. The air was suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I stumbled into another room and slammed the door behind me, pressing my back against it. My heart was pounding, my breaths shallow and rapid. That's when I saw the mirror. It was cracked, its frame ornate and tarnished, but it reflected the room perfectly, or at least it should have. Instead of my reflection, the mirror showed the shadow, standing directly behind me. I screamed, spinning around to face the entity, but the room was empty. The mirror shattered on its own, shards flying across the room like projectiles. One sliced across my arm, drawing blood. The pain snapped me back to reality. I needed to get out. I turned the door handle and was met with resistance. Something was holding it shut. The whispers reached a crescendo, the voices now screaming incoherently. I was trapped. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The door flew open, and a blinding light engulfed the room. When I woke up, I was lying outside the asylum, my camera next to me. The sun was rising, casting the building in an eerie orange glow. My SUV was still parked where I'd left it, but I had no memory of how I got out. I checked my camera, half expecting it to be broken, but it powered on. The last photo on the memory card wasn't one I remembered taking. It was of me, standing in room 214, with the shadow looming over me. I never returned to Ridgeway Asylum, and I never finished that project. I shared my story with a few close friends, but their skeptical faces told me everything I needed to know. Even now, years later, I wake up in cold sweats, haunted by the memory of that night. The scar on my arm is a permanent reminder of how close I came to something far beyond my understanding. I don't know what saved me, or why. But one thing is certain. There are forces in this world we will never understand. Forces that don't care if you believe in them or not. Sometimes they let you leave. Sometimes they don't. There's a moment sailors dread more than storms or mutinies, the inexplicable. It's not the wind or the waves that unnerve you. It's the unknown, that creeping, hollow feeling when you realize you're not alone, even in the middle of nowhere. And I, Captain Liam Hargrove, never believed in ghosts until the summer of 2019, off the jagged coast of Nova Scotia. We were 6 days into our voyage, delivering cargo from Halifax to Greenland. The ship, the Mariner's Grace, was sturdy, though a little aged, and my crew of 8 seasoned men and women knew her quirks like the backs of their hands. The sea had been kind to us. Calm waters, clear skies, nothing unusual. Until that night. It started with the fog, a thick, soupy mass that rolled in out of nowhere, swallowing the horizon. One moment, we were sailing beneath a crescent moon. The next, we were blind. Fog isn't uncommon up here, but this wasn't normal. It was cold, colder than any fog I'd ever felt. The air was sharp, biting at exposed skin, and carried an odd, metallic tang. "All hands on deck," I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. The crew scrambled to their stations, muttering uneasily. I stood at the bow, scanning the mist for any sign of danger. That's when I heard it. A bell. Faint at first, then louder, tolling steadily through the fog. It wasn't our bell. Ours was silent, its chain swaying idly in the still air. The sound chilled me. It was coming from somewhere ahead. "Captain," said Ben, my first mate, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" "Aye," I replied, gripping the rail. "Slow us down." The engines whirred to a crawl as we drifted forward, the fog parting reluctantly before us. The bell grew louder, joined by something else. Voices. Low and indistinct, they murmured just out of comprehension, like whispers carried on the wind. Then we saw it. A ship emerged from the mist, its silhouette towering and ghostly. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, its hull dark and jagged like the skeletal remains of a giant beast. The vessel was ancient, its sails tattered, its masts splintered. Rust streaked its sides, and seaweed clung to its bow like a funeral shroud. But what caught my eye was the name scrawled on its hull, the Tempest's Mercy. I froze. That ship had sunk nearly a century ago, a legend among mariners. It had been caught in a fierce storm in 1923, its crew lost to the depths. But here it was, impossibly intact, looming in the fog like a specter. "It's not real," whispered Elaine, our navigator, her voice trembling. "It can't be." But it was real. Too real. "Ben, take the wheel," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to circle around it. Keep your distance." The crew obeyed, though their unease was palpable. As we turned, the fog seemed to shift, swirling around us like a living thing. And then, as if on cue, the lights on the ghost ship flickered to life. "What the hell?" muttered Jake, our engineer, his eyes wide. Yellow lanterns glowed on the decks, casting eerie shadows that danced across the water. Figures moved within the light, indistinct shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. They were human-shaped, but wrong, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Captain," Ben said, his voice tight, "we've got to get out of here." "Not yet," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to leave. Curiosity overrode fear. What was this thing? A hallucination? A ghost? I had to know. "Elaine, signal them," I commanded. She hesitated but nodded, sending a series of light flashes with our signal lamp. 3 short, 3 long. 3 short, the universal distress call. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ghost ship responded. The lanterns dimmed, then brightened in the same pattern. SOS. The air grew heavier, oppressive. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of despair. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, anguished. "Shut it off!" Jake shouted, covering his ears. "Make it stop!" Elaine turned off the lamp, but the whispers persisted, growing louder. And then we heard the screams. Blood-curdling, inhuman wails erupted from the ship, echoing across the water. The figures on deck froze, their heads snapping toward us in unison. Their faces, or what should have been faces, then were blank. Smooth, featureless skin stretched where eyes, noses, and mouths should be. They stared at us, if staring was even possible, and began to move. They climbed over the railings, one by one, dropping into the sea without a sound. The water didn't splash. It accepted them silently, unnaturally. "Reverse engines," I barked. "Now!" The crew didn't need convincing. The ship groaned as we tried to back away, but the fog clung to us like a vice. The ghost ship didn't move, but the figures. They were in the water now, swimming toward us with impossible speed. "They're coming," shouted Ben, pointing. The first one reached our hull, clawing at the metal with pale, boneless hands. Others followed, dozens of them, their featureless heads bobbing in the water like buoys. One began to climb the side, its movements insect-like and wrong. Jake grabbed a wrench and swung at it as it reached the deck, striking it square in the head. The thing didn't bleed. It crumpled like wet paper, collapsing into a heap before dissolving into a puddle of black sludge. More were coming. "Weapons!" I shouted. "Anything you can find!" The crew armed themselves with wrenches, pipes, even flares, fighting off the creatures as they swarmed the deck. I joined the fray, my heart pounding as I swung a crowbar at one of the things. It screeched and dissolved like the first, but there were too many. For every one we defeated, 3 more took its place. "Captain!" Elaine cried. "The ghost ship! It's moving!" I turned. She was right. The Tempest's Mercy was drifting toward us, its lanterns flickering violently. The bell tolled again, louder and faster, as if in warning. The whispers grew deafening, the voices screaming now, an unholy cacophony that made my ears bleed. "We have to abandon ship," Ben yelled. "No," I said, though my voice wavered. "We're not leaving her. We'll fight." But deep down, I knew it was hopeless. The ghost ship was upon us now, its hull scraping against ours with a sound that set my teeth on edge. The figures on our deck froze, then turned as if answering a silent call. They climbed back into the water, retreating to the Tempest's Mercy. For a brief, hopeful moment, I thought it was over, but then the ghost ship's lanterns went out. Darkness enveloped us, total and suffocating. The whispers stopped, replaced by silence so absolute it was almost worse. Then the fog began to dissipate, revealing the open sea once more. The Tempest's Mercy was gone. We drifted in stunned silence, the crew battered and bleeding but alive. The fog had lifted completely, and the moonlight bathed the water in an eerie glow. But the sense of relief was short-lived. "Captain," Elaine said, her voice trembling. She pointed to the horizon. There, far in the distance, the ghost ship reappeared, its lanterns flickering faintly. It wasn't coming toward us anymore. It was waiting. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. The official report says we suffered a mass hallucination brought on by toxic fumes from a ruptured tank. But we know the truth. The Tempest's Mercy is still out there, haunting the seas, waiting for its next victims. And if you ever hear a bell tolling in the fog, turn back. Don't investigate. Don't get curious, because some shipwrecks aren't meant to stay sunken. There's a sound that only comes when the forest is dark, a low, guttural scream that seems to rattle the very leaves. I'd heard it twice before, and both times I thought I imagined it. But the night I went looking for the source, I realized how wrong I'd been. My name is James Parker. I'm 29 years old and live in a small town in northern Maine, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest thrill is a new batch of gossip at the diner. My life had been uneventful until the night the screaming started. It was late September, the time of year when the air smells of damp leaves and the sky gets dark before you're ready. I'd taken up hiking to clear my mind after a messy breakup, and the trails behind my house had become my sanctuary. They cut through dense woods that stretched for miles, a mix of pine, birch, and oak. Peaceful, isolated, or so I thought. The first time I heard it, I was about a mile into the forest. The sun had set, leaving the woods bathed in a dusky glow. I'd stopped to tie my boot when it came, a bone-chilling wail that froze me in place. It was like a mix between a human scream and the howl of an injured animal echoing through the trees. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip, but there was nothing. No rustling leaves, no glowing eyes in the underbrush. Just silence. I chalked it up to my imagination, or maybe a coyote, and headed back home. But the sound haunted me. lingering in the back of my mind like an unresolved chord. A week later, I heard it again, this time closer to home. It came from the edge of the woods near my backyard, long after midnight. I didn't sleep that night. When the third scream came, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. Curiosity overrode caution, and I told myself I had to find out what was making that sound. Armed with a flashlight, a hunting knife, and my phone, I ventured into the forest. The sky was clear, a full moon casting pale light through the canopy. The air was still, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. About a half-mile in, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The forest seemed wrong. The trees were gnarled, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers. The underbrush was unnaturally sparse, the ground covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled my footsteps. And then there was the silence. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. The first scream came just as I reached the old footbridge that crossed a shallow creek. This time, it was so loud it made my chest vibrate. It came from deeper in the woods, an agonized cry that lasted several seconds before cutting off abruptly. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, the screen shaking in my hands as I tried to record. But the moment I hit record, the forest went deathly quiet again. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to go home and lock the doors. But something primal, something deeper, urged me forward. I crossed the bridge and followed the sound, or rather, the absence of sound, deeper into the woods. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy here, and I had to rely on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. About an hour in, I stumbled upon a clearing. The ground was bare, the trees forming a perfect circle around it as if nature itself had been forced to withdraw. In the center stood an old stone structure, weathered and cracked. It looked like an altar or maybe a marker covered in strange carvings that seemed to shift when I stared at them too long. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air here was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A figure crouched on the far side of the clearing. It was humanoid, but impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural grace. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The figure seemed to sense me, its head snapping up to reveal a face that wasn't a face at all. Just a smooth expanse of skin, featureless and horrifying, and then it screamed. The sound was deafening, a piercing wail that sent me stumbling backward. My flashlight slipped from my grip and hit the ground, plunging me into darkness. Panic took over and I scrambled to pick it up, the beam cutting wildly through the clearing. The figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I ran, my legs burning as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. The screams followed me closer and closer, echoing from every direction. It felt like the forest itself was alive, twisting and shifting to trap me. When I finally burst out of the woods and into my backyard, the screams stopped. The silence was almost worse. I collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air, my hands trembling so badly I could barely unlock my back door. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, heard that scream. I tried to tell myself it was a nightmare, a trick of the mind. But the carvings on that stone structure, the oppressive silence, the unnatural way the forest seemed to move. It was all too real. I haven't gone back into the woods since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the screams again, faint and distant. They're always coming from the direction of that clearing. I've thought about telling someone, but what could I say? That the forest behind my house is haunted by something that shouldn't exist? So I've kept it to myself, trying to convince myself that as long as I stay out of the woods, I'll be safe. But deep down, I know it's not over. The forest that screams is still there, waiting. And one day, I'm afraid it's going to come for me. I don't think I'm alone down here." Those were the first words I managed to choke out over the crackling walkie-talkie as the dim beam of my flashlight danced along the damp stone walls. The air was cold, unseasonably so, and I could swear the shadows were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I knew coming here alone was a mistake, but I had something to prove. Not to anyone else, but to myself. My name is Mark Henderson, and I'm a 29-year-old journalist chasing stories that most people would dismiss as folklore or urban legends. This time I was in southern Indiana, investigating reports of hauntings tied to the Underground Railroad. The small town of Black Hollow wasn't on any map, and its locals didn't take kindly to outsiders poking around. But a story was a story, and this one had teeth. A few weeks back, I stumbled across an old letter archived in the town's library. It was dated 1856 and written by a local man, Amos Grant, who claimed to have witnessed something unholy while helping slaves escape through a hidden tunnel system. He described the watchers in the dark, ghostly figures who preyed on the living and the dead. Now I stood in one of those very tunnels, flashlight in hand, recording equipment strapped to my chest, and a rising sense of dread sinking into my bones. The entrance had been hidden behind a rusted metal grate in the basement of the only remaining antebellum mansion in town. I'd slipped past the no trespassing signs and into history. I didn't expect to find what I did. The tunnel walls were carved from rough limestone, lined with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of decades. The ground beneath me was soft, a mix of dirt and moisture that clung to my boots with every step. I moved cautiously, aware that the structure was ancient and probably unstable. About 100 yards in, my flashlight flickered. I tapped it, cursing under my breath. That's when I heard the first sound, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, and strained my ears. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice echoed eerily, bouncing off the walls and returning to me distorted, like a mocking taunt. The whisper came again, clearer this time, though still indistinct. It sounded like a woman. I swept my flashlight around, the beam landing on the jagged walls, the uneven floor, and a small, half-rotted wooden box. Kneeling, I opened it. Inside were a pair of children's shoes, worn and frayed, and a scrap of fabric that looked like it might have been part of a dress. I set the box down, trying to ignore the cold shiver that ran up my spine. When I looked up, the tunnel ahead was no longer empty. There was a figure, barely visible in the weak light, standing motionless about 20 feet away. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled backward, fumbling for the walkie-talkie clipped to my jacket. "Hello?" I stammered. The figure didn't move. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I shone my flashlight directly at it, but the beam seemed to pass through, illuminating nothing but the stone behind it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I pressed on, though every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn back. Something about this place felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching me. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the whispers became more frequent. They weren't alone anymore. Now there were faint sobs, the clinking of chains, and occasionally a sharp guttural scream that made my stomach churn. My recorder picked up every sound, each one sharper and more menacing than the last. At one point, I tripped over something buried in the dirt. Digging it out, I found a rusted iron shackle, its edges stained dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. That's when I realized the whispers weren't random. They were trying to tell me something. "Run." The word was clear, unmistakable. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that resonated through the tunnel, shaking the walls and sending a shower of dust raining down on me. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip, and caught sight of another figure. This one crawling on all fours, its head twisted completely backward, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. I ran. The tunnel twisted and branched off in multiple directions, each path looking more foreboding than the last. My breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of my boots slapping against the wet ground mingling with the whispers and the growls that seemed to follow me no matter which way I turned. Eventually, I stumbled into a larger chamber, its walls covered in strange markings carved deep into the stone. Symbols, spirals, and what looked like crude human figures in various states of agony. At the center of the chamber was a circular pit, its edges lined with charred wood and bones that looked far too human for comfort. The air here was oppressive, thick with an unidentifiable stench that made my eyes water. I approached the pit cautiously, peering into the darkness below. A hand shot out, skeletal and impossibly fast, grabbing my ankle and yanking me forward. I screamed, kicking frantically until the grip loosened and I scrambled backward. Emerging from the pit was a figure draped in tattered blackened cloth, its face hidden except for two hollow voids where eyes should have been. It reached for me, its bony fingers brushing against my boot before I scrambled to my feet and bolted. By the time I found the exit, I was covered in dirt and sweat, my lungs burning from exertion. The tunnel had spat me out into the woods behind the mansion, the moonlight offering a faint reprieve from the darkness I'd just escaped. But the whispers followed me. Even now, weeks later, I can hear them in the quiet of my apartment, see the figures lingering just out of sight in the corners of my vision. I've replayed the recordings 100 times, and they're all the proof I need. The Underground Railroad wasn't just a pathway to freedom, it was a battleground, a place where unimaginable horrors left scars that time can't erase. And now those horrors know my name. I thought uncovering the truth would bring closure, but all it's done is open a door that should have stayed shut. I always told myself I didn't believe in ghosts. Growing up, I'd laugh off horror stories and urban legends my friends swore were real. But last summer, something happened that changed me, something I'll carry with me until the day I die. It began on a sticky August night in the small rural town of Harpeth, Tennessee. I'd returned to my childhood home to help my mother sort through my late grandmother's belongings. The house, a creaky, sprawling Victorian with peeling white paint and crooked shutters, always gave me the creeps as a kid. That night the air was heavy and the crickets were deafening. My mom had gone to bed hours earlier, leaving me alone in the cluttered dining room to sort through dusty photo albums and stacks of yellowed papers. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb dangling overhead. Shadows danced on the faded floral wallpaper, and the room felt unnervingly alive. I was halfway through a box labeled Basement when I found it, a small black leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with initials I didn't recognize, EMG. Curious, I flipped it open. The pages were brittle, filled with spidery handwriting that was hard to read. The first entry was dated August 12th, 1927, exactly 96 years to the day. As I read, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. The entries described eerie occurrences in the house, strange whispers at night, objects moving on their own, and, most unsettling of all, a recurring dream of a hand reaching out from the darkness. The writer's words grew frantic over time, as if they were unraveling. The final entry ended abruptly. It's not just a dream, it's here, and it's waiting. The room felt colder. I glanced nervously at the doorway leading to the basement. The old wooden door was closed, but I swore I saw something shift in the gap beneath it. A shadow? A trick of the light? I tried to shake it off and kept reading, but the air felt heavier with each passing moment. Then came the sound. A faint, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps on the basement stairs. I froze, my heart hammering. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. Someone, or something, was coming up. I wanted to run, to wake my mom and get the hell out of that house, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The doorknob jiggled, and the door creaked open an inch. The thudding stopped. I stared, paralyzed, as a pale skeletal hand slid through the gap and curled around the edge of the door. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, my mom was shaking me awake on the couch. "You fell asleep," she said, her face a mix of concern and annoyance. "You were dreaming." Dreaming. Sure, that's what I wanted to believe. But when I glanced at the dining room table, the journal was gone. The basement door was ajar, and a faint, cool draft wafted up the stairs. Over the next few days, strange things started happening around the house. Small at first. A glass would tip over on its own. A door that had been closed would be open when I turned around. My mom dismissed it all as my imagination, but I could see the worry in her eyes. One night, while she was out visiting a friend, I decided to face my fear. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I crept down to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. The flashlight beam trembled as I scanned the room, illuminating stacks of old boxes, cobwebbed shelves, and the rusty boiler in the corner. And then I saw it. The journal, lying open on the floor, as if waiting for me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me to pick it up. As I did, the basement door slammed shut behind me. The bulb above me flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the gloom. That's when I heard it, a raspy, guttural whisper coming from somewhere behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Shadows that seemed to move, to breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed toward the stairs. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from all directions. And then I felt it. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, grabbing my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but it wouldn't let go. The flashlight slipped from my grasp and shattered on the concrete floor. Total darkness. "Let me go!" I shrieked, clawing at the stairs, but the grip tightened, pulling me down. My fingers scraped against the splintered wood as I was dragged deeper into the blackness. Just as I thought I was lost, the pressure released, and I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't tell my mom what happened either. What could I say? That a phantom hand tried to drag me into the abyss? She'd think I'd lost my mind. The final straw came 3 nights later. I was lying in bed, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the old timbers. I had locked my bedroom door, but that didn't stop it. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the feeling of something cold brushing against my face. My eyes flew open, and there it was, the hand, pale, bony, and impossibly long, reaching out from the shadows beside my bed. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering as it crept closer, its fingers curling as if to grab me. I screamed and flicked on the bedside lamp, but the hand was gone. Only the faint outline of a smudge, like soot or ash, remained on my pillow. I knew then that I couldn't stay in that house another night. The next morning, I packed my things and left, making some excuse about needing to get back to work. My mom didn't question it, though I could see the sadness in her eyes. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark and empty except for one. On the second floor, a pale face watched me go. Months have passed, but I still can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed. At night, I'll catch movement in my peripheral vision or feel the faintest touch on my shoulder when no one's there. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but it doesn't help. Last week, I woke up to find the journal on my nightstand. I burned it in the fireplace, watching the pages curl and blacken, but deep down, I know it's not over. Because sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll feel it again. That cold, skeletal hand, reaching out from the darkness, waiting for me. It started with a dare. "Bet you won't last an hour in Deadwood Cemetery," Jake said, his voice dripping with mockery. The challenge cut through the small circle of our group like a blade. the flickering firelight reflecting his smirk. I should have said no. Everyone knew about Deadwood, a graveyard as old as the town itself, left to rot under the creeping embrace of nature. The stories about it weren't just idle folklore. People claimed to hear whispers among the headstones and shadows moving where they shouldn't. But I couldn't let Jake win. That's how I ended up standing at the rusted iron gates of the cemetery at midnight, a flashlight in one hand and my phone recording in the other. The wind carried the faint, sour smell of decay, and the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. "I'm here," I muttered, more to convince myself than to document for the video. The camera caught the warped and mossy gravestones that seemed to lean toward me, their inscriptions eroded to illegibility. My breath fogged in the cold air, though it wasn't cold enough for that. The gate creaked shut behind me. I told myself it was just the wind, but that sound, like nails scraping stone, followed me as I walked deeper into the graveyard. My flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows over the ancient mausoleums. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting me. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the flashlight's beam, motionless and silent. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was there, unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called, though my voice wavered. The figure didn't move, didn't answer. My instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but the rational part of my brain insisted it was just a trick of the light. I took a cautious step closer, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounding deafeningly loud. The figure melted into the shadows. I swung the flashlight around wildly, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. But there was nothing, only rows of gravestones and the skeletal outlines of trees. The air grew colder. I told myself to keep moving. Just an hour, I thought. 1 hour, and I'd prove Jake and everyone else wrong. But as I walked, the graveyard seemed to change. Paths twisted in ways they shouldn't, leading me back to places I'd already been. The inscriptions on the gravestones looked clearer now, even though my flashlight wasn't any brighter. Names I didn't recognize etched themselves into my memory. Margaret Wells, beloved daughter. James Carver, lost to the fire. Then the whispers began. At first I thought it was the wind again, but these were voices, low, insistent, and coming from beneath me. I knelt and pressed my ear to the ground, the cold, damp earth chilling my skin. "Help us," I jerked back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voices were real. I wasn't imagining it. Suddenly, I felt the unmistakable sensation of fingers brushing my ankle. I scrambled backward, kicking at the dirt, but nothing was there. The graveyard was silent again, except for my own ragged breathing. "Calm down," I whispered to myself. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But when I stood, the ground beneath my feet shifted unnaturally, as though something was pushing up from below. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the earth cracked open, revealing a skeletal hand clawing its way out of the grave. My legs refused to move. All I could do was watch as the figure emerged, a decayed, shrouded corpse, its empty sockets staring straight at me. Then another hand burst through the soil, and another. I turned and ran. The paths twisted and folded in on themselves, leading me in circles. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there were more of them, figures dragging themselves out of their graves, their movements slow but deliberate. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight skittering out of my hand. Its beam landed on the face of one of the risen dead, a woman with half her jaw missing, her skeletal grin fixed in a horrifying rictus. She opened her mouth, and that same voice whispered, "Help us." I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the flashlight, the beam shaking as badly as my hands. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice echoing through the cemetery. The figures stopped. For one chilling moment, everything was still. Then they all turned to face the same direction, behind me. I turned slowly, the beam of the flashlight landing on something that froze the blood in my veins. A towering figure loomed in the distance, its shape barely human. It wore a tattered cloak that seemed to writhe like it was alive, and its face, or lack thereof, was a void, a gaping absence that pulled at my sanity. The dead began to kneel, their rotting forms bowing before the figure. It raised an impossibly long arm and pointed at me. A voice boomed in my head, not spoken, but felt, like a vibration rattling through my skull. "You don't belong here." My legs finally obeyed me. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, dodging gravestones and vaults as the dead began to rise again, their bony fingers grasping at me. I reached the gates, but they wouldn't budge. My hands fumbled with the latch, but it was as if the rusted iron had fused together. Behind me, the keeper of the graveyard drew closer, its presence a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. I banged on the gates, screaming for help, but no sound escaped my throat. Then I saw it. A small gap in the fence, just big enough to squeeze through. I didn't think. I just threw myself at it, the metal tearing at my clothes and skin as I forced my way out. The moment I hit the ground on the other side, the noises stopped. The oppressive air lifted. When I turned back, the graveyard was silent. The keeper was gone, and the dead were once again at rest. But as I limped back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And when I looked at my phone later, the video was still recording. In the final frame, just before I escaped, the keeper's void-like face stared directly into the lens,